All right. Well, it is 11:01, at least where we are in the world. Thank you all for being here. My name is Helen Schroeder. I'm the marketing coordinator at Sigma Assessments, and I will be your co-host for today. You may have seen me at some past webinars. You may have also seen our presenter today, Dr. Ariana Thompson. She's been with us before and has kindly returned today to teach us a little bit about succession planning. For those of you who are new to Sigma, we are a professional services firm that offers talent development services such as succession planning, but also psychological assessments, talent development, and other workshops and educational opportunities. Sigma has been in business for over 50 years, so we have a lot of experience and stories to share with you today, and we're thrilled to have you join us. A little bit of housekeeping. We've got about 60 minutes together. For the first 45 minutes or so, Ariana will take you through our webinar content. As we go, please post any questions that you have in the Q&A box. We will collect those and save 10 to 15 minutes at the end to go through those together. And if any other questions come up live, you can type those in as we go as well. We will be recording this session. You will receive a recording of the webinar as well as a PDF copy of the slides, so no need to take notes. And if there's anything that we don't get to today, you're welcome to email us afterwards, and we would be happy to continue the conversation. But for now, use the Q&A box. Don't be shy. That's what it's there for. And now I will introduce you to Ariana and pass it off to her to start the presentation. So Dr. Ariana Thompson is a senior leadership consultant. She believes in positively transforming the modern day workplace through thought-provoking, evidence-based insights. Ariana is a subject matter expert in executive leadership, succession management, wellness cultures, and employee growth. In her work with Sigma, she supports executive teams with succession planning and leadership development and assessment. So thank you, Ariana, for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Helen. Welcome everyone to our webinar called How to Build a Comprehensive Succession Plan. As an overview of our webinar agenda, today we'll be starting with the basics, including what is succession planning, what is the difference between succession planning and replacement hiring, and why is succession planning important? Then we'll move into comprehensively discussing Sigma's 6-step succession planning process, which is an excellent evidence-based method for going about succession planning. And then we'll close out with some tips, including addressing common pitfalls, the greatest hurdle implementation, and why you might want to work with consultants through this process. We'll also have a number of polls throughout our session, so we're going to want to get you engaged and hear what you have to say and some of our poll questions. So I'm excited to be with you here today. So let's jump in. What is succession planning? Succession planning is the process of identifying and developing internal talent to fill critical roles when vacancies occur. So some keywords here are identifying and developing talent and making sure you're ready when vacancies occur, especially in advance of those vacancies. Therefore, robust succession plans share a few core features, including being goal-oriented, knowing what the objective of this strategic plan is, what you're trying to accomplish, and how will you know if you did indeed accomplish your objectives. A succession plan is going to be ongoing over time. It's not going to be a one-time plan, but it's hopefully going to be a plan that gets implemented going forward into the future. And this also means it needs to be updated over time, especially as this addresses plans for vacancies. We know that turnover is a part of the organizational lifespan and that there will be turnover. So it's about preparing for those turnover situations and being prepared with developed candidates when those vacancies occur. So this may need to be a changing plan over time. As people leave, as people change positions, you're going to want to update your succession plan along the way. And let's say one person moves up into a new role, you may still want to think about what you'll do if that person leaves. So it's really an ongoing strategic initiative. And a good succession plan will therefore build a pool of qualified candidates for each critical role within an organization, provide opportunities for employee growth and development in order to address skill gaps that are needed to be addressed to get to the next level. And it can also increase confidence in the company's ability to fill vacant roles, making operations more smooth and seamless over time. And there's no vacancies that would be holding up operations. So all this being said, succession plans are important because they provide your company with a roadmap for continuity when changes and vacancies occur. So I'm going to open it up for our first poll now. We'd love to hear from you. Does your company currently have a succession plan? We'll give it a few more seconds. All right, let's see how we all scored here. Interesting. It looks like about a third of our audience today does have a documented succession planning process, and another third has an undocumented succession planning process. Another 20% has a few replacements in mind, and then about 12% has not thought about succession or is not sure. So I see that we have a variety of expertise in this audience, some who are already engaging in succession planning and some who are just in the beginning stages of thinking about it. So thank you so much for that. That's helpful information. Next, we're going to talk about the difference between succession planning and what is typically done, which is what we call replacement hiring. So replacement hiring is what most organizations use if they're not being strategic about succession planning at this time. It's when a vacancy arises and there's a reactive need to immediately fill a vacancy. So in this scenario, you usually just choose the next person available. It's usually a quick process of choosing the next person to get in the door. We often see that leaders are trying to replace the previous or current incumbent. So you kind of are trying to duplicate someone else in your next candidate. Very frequently, it's only using input from the supervisor and the incumbent if they're there. But a lot of times if the incumbent has already left, you're only using input from a supervisor, which makes your information a lot more limited. And you're only selecting one person. And this can bias objectivity because it's a very reactive, quick decision where it's kind of based on being at the right place at the right time. So therefore, the process is just kind of a reactive hiring done as needed process. So this is in contrast with succession planning that is more proactive. You're preparing multiple candidates for the role. And when a vacancy arises, you choose the best candidate, even if they're different from the current incumbent. So it's really focused on the skills and abilities needed rather than duplicating somebody else. And this process uses feedback from multiple sources. So if you know what a 360 is, it's fairly similar where you're taking a rounded out view of collecting information. So from the current incumbent, from the supervisor, and then in our Sigma succession process, we often also leverage other people on the team giving input on the required competencies for any given role. And this process creates a bench of successors for each role where you have multiple candidates prepared in the case of a vacancy. And this really enhances objectivity as selection and promotion can occur more objectively based on merits and aptitude. And therefore, this process is really integrated with the holistic employee functioning, such as being integrated with recruitment, development, and diversity initiatives. So now after this, we'd like to open up our next poll for you, which is where are you currently at? Are you more succession planning or replacement hiring at this time? So we'll give everyone a little time to answer this question. All right. So this is interesting. Despite a third of our audience today having succession planning in place, still only 11% of our audience does do succession planning when vacancies arise, while 60% do replacement hiring. Although I do see a mix here where 30% are mixed in their approach. So maybe that means that some people's succession plan are really focused at the executive level, but maybe for lower positions, they may be engaging with increased replacement hiring. So thank you. So this brings us to the final introductory slide around why succession planning matters. Well, we know turnover is inevitable for all organizations. And like I said, succession planning can help you prepare for vacancies well in advance. And succession planning helps organizations to retain institutional knowledge. So if you know someone is going to eventually be moving on, you can create processes and understand what they know in the organization and make sure that institutional knowledge is transferred to the next generation of leaders. This can motivate employees to engage in succession planning if you are engaging in succession planning and getting them involved, which ties into the next point of it can create a culture of growth and development as people are looking forward, feeling that their career desires are being acknowledged and they're being developed to potentially take on a future leadership role. This in turn can attract and retain staff long-term, as this is something that especially the newest generations in the workforce are looking for, with priority for that growth and development. And as mentioned, it can improve objective decision-making. So with this, we're going to jump into talking about Sigma's 6-step succession planning process. So I'll be going over each 6 of these steps in greater depth, but the 6 steps are to first identify critical roles. From those critical roles, begin building a success profile for each critical role. Then once you know what it takes to have success in a role, you can begin nominating successors and assessing the development needs of those successors, and then beginning the talent development process. And lastly, measuring progress, so you know what outcomes you are achieving over time and are collecting some initial baseline indicators so you're able to track that progress. Sigma also has a number of developed templates based on best practices that we can offer in order to help take you through this process, such as our critical role identification questionnaire or a Sigma success profile. I'll be showing a few of these today, but you can access more on our Sigma website. The first step of our 6-step succession planning process is to identify critical roles. So what is a critical role? A critical role is any role that, if vacant, would create operational challenges due to the vacancy. So you imagine someone leaving the organization and it leaving a gap that could impede operational success. And this can actually be any role in an organization. We often think of the most senior level, which is needed, and it is actually very concerning if you have, for example, a vacancy in the CEO position for 6 months or longer, and the organization may feel a sense of instability due to that person not having that role filled, and it may create some confusion in the organization and uncertainty. However, other roles can be critical as well, such as having a key software engineer where they're developing technology for the organization, and if they're gone, perhaps that creates challenges in delivering your company's product. So these are just examples. But some tips in identifying critical roles include starting with key roles, including upper management and leadership. So it's good to start somewhere, and leadership positions are critical to organizational functioning. But then making sure you're looking at positions beyond that, such as administrative staff, or, like I said, critical individual contributors. And this can also be areas with high dependencies or a little overlap in skill sets. So again, maybe your specialized skills that make your organization effective and have that competitive edge. At this time in the very beginning of your succession planning process, it is okay to consider both essential people and essential positions, although typically we like to focus on the role itself just to create that objectivity. But there may be positions where, if you have never engaged in succession planning, people may wear, as we call it, multiple hats and be doing multiple jobs. So you may need to look at your essential people as well and see what it is they're doing, whether or not their role needs to be split into 2 and beyond. Once you've identified critical roles in your organization, you can move on to building success profiles. So we believe that there should be one success profile for each critical role that you've identified. although it is okay to roll this out over time, starting with the leadership level and then going down to next levels within the organization. And when creating success profiles, consider behaviors that are important for success in that specific role, success in the organization more broadly, and success in the role both now and into the future. So we often will, as a part of our succession planning workshops, talk about what the forecast for your organization's future is. How might technology change things? How is the market looking? How are stakeholder needs evolving? So these are also things that we should consider when building a success profile. So to give you an example of a success profile, here is just a sample success profile that has been adapted from some client experiences that we've had. So this gives you an example of what a success profile might look like and how it's different from a job description, although they do have similarities. So you see at the top here, this would be for a succession position of an HR director, and the current incumbent's name here is named as Jane Smith. And they have an expected vacancy of next year in 2024, making it a 5-star, 5 out of 5 top level priority. And then for the success profile, we list both leadership competencies that are needed as well as role competencies. And we do leadership level competencies to see what, as a leadership team, are the core competencies that you will need to fit into and embody to be a strong leader. But then also we tap into core role competencies that are needed to have success in your role. So for example, to be an effective leader at this organization, you need to be decisive, objective, and be able to prioritize. However, the core role competencies for this HR leader are things like valuing diversity, attracting staff, and developing and coaching others. We also have some core role and leadership level future competencies, as well as position demographics and position criteria. And if you look at the left-hand side, the position criteria is some of the components you would typically see on a typical job description. And we usually have position criteria that fill up the whole page, but some of these are just examples for your benefit. So including educational requirements, experience requirements, and then any other specialized skills that might be needed, such as an HR director needing to know HR softwares and benefits and payroll. So I hope this has been a helpful example for you to understand what is a success profile and why it's important. Once you have success profiles for all of your critical roles in your organization, you can move on to the step of nominating successors. And we want to say at this time, you're not nominating one successor. You don't actually, you don't decide on the final successor until the vacancy is present. And at that point, it becomes a decision time to pick the top successor. But at this stage, you actually want to cast a wide net and consider anyone in your organization who could be a potential successor for this position that you're looking at. So therefore, we challenge you to include not only direct reports, but maybe other individuals the next layer down or cross-functional and other teams. You can think of it as a leadership pipeline feeding into your role rather than simply selecting that next one successor. And you want to consider candidates who might be ready for the role soon, as well as those who might need a significant amount of development. So even if you, let's say, sometimes we have roles that are projected to be vacant in 3 to 4 years, well, that actually gives you a significant amount of time to look at your talent and begin that talent development process. So just remember that your successors do not need to be ready tomorrow. They just need to be ready in time, including with developmental efforts. So another template that Sigma has as a cool tool in our toolbox is the succession bench. So following the example from earlier of the HR director named Jane Smith, who's going to be expected to have a vacancy in 2024. And we'll just say that this vacancy is due to retirement. She's been in the workforce for a long time and is ready to retire. This is how her bench might look. This has 2 people at what we call the bench strength of A and 1 person at the big bench strength of B. So a level A candidate would be ready in 1 to 3 years, and a level B candidate might be ready in 3 to 5 years. So this would be taken from her team or other people in her organization. So we have some people listed here. And the people in the level A candidate might be HR managers, who the next step would be a director role. But the level B candidate might be an HR lead, and their next position might be an HR manager, and they're ready for that next step of an HR manager in 6 months. But we show you this to show you that the path might take some time, and Sarah Jensen in level B could be considered as a potential successor, even though she's not ready immediately. So let's say she gets promoted in a year to an HR lead and her readiness for the next level increases, she might move in time to be a level A candidate. So I know there's more we might be able to explore here, but this is just a quick look at our succession bench and how it can be used. All right, so at this time, you've identified critical roles, built out success profiles for each of those roles, and nominated successors, forming a ongoing bench that you can edit and update over time. So at this time, it is helpful to assess the developmental needs of those successors. And assessing candidate skills serves a number of purposes. You can determine their areas of strengths and their areas of opportunity. You can validate each candidate's position on the succession bench to see if that does align with their readiness. And you can assess a baseline of skill in which you can evaluate if you have coaching happening to see coaching success. So in other words, assessing development needs really helps you understand where each candidate is today and where they're going to need to grow in order to reach the next level of leadership. Something else that we're passionate about at Sigma Assessment Systems is leveraging scientifically validated psychometric assessments to actually capture some of these skill areas. So leveraging assessments is great because it adds another unbiased method in which you can assess where a candidate is at. Although we do often encourage leaders and other people to give feedback on how that person is doing and support them in identifying their development needs. An assessment can really take it that next step. You can put all your leaders through assessments, and it can be a really insightful way to learn about how they're doing, their areas of strengths and development. And it can also build some camaraderie in the culture as people are looking at their assessments and comparing how they were doing and having these developmental discussions. So once you've assessed developmental needs, it makes sense the next step would be to actually go ahead and begin developmental efforts to develop your talent. And this involves helping candidates to determine the developmental priorities that they are going to focus on, find opportunities to learn and practice new skills, including things like stretch assignments, and overcoming obstacles or challenges to successful development. So having an ongoing communication with them, helping them to find those next opportunities, or it could be even finding training opportunities or certification programs. So developing talent can look a lot of different ways. One worksheet that we help people to fill out just to get some initial thoughts going on this area is mapping out the candidates who were on your succession bench, putting their current level, and then planning some developmental activities. So the ones we have here on this worksheet are job shadowing, coaching, self-directed learning, and group training. So for example, we believe that level A candidates are the best candidates at this time, although, Sarah could move into being a level A candidate. And that means that they're more ready to take on the next role. So something like job shadowing and leadership coaching could be really helpful for boosting their development and getting them to the next level. For all of these candidates, we recommend group training. So for example, at Sigma Assessment Systems, if we do assessments with a group of leaders, we can often see shared competency gaps and provide leadership training that addresses shared needs. But for the level B candidate, we also put a greater focus on self-directed learning. So this could be an online training program where they can engage in learning themselves or getting some books on a topic or things like that. But typically at the level B candidate, we might not emphasize certain developmental efforts as much, but again, this will really depend on your unique organizational needs, what kind of resources you have to develop talent, and how you want to prioritize those resources. You could also add a lot of notes here. We have a lot of other activities that we could do to support this developmental planning activity. So this is not the only template we have available, but just a quick first look. All right, so now the final step is to talk about measuring progress. And measuring progress is really helpful if you are someone at the organization that's trying to show to other organizational stakeholders why succession matters and why you should track the progress over time. And the best metrics are those used to reflect success in your company. So before you begin your succession plan, it's important to think about the metrics that you think would be relevant and to record them as a baseline. Then you can update your metrics every 6 months to a year to evaluate progress. So common metrics include rates of turnover or percentage of roles that are filled internally. But we do see in our consulting practice that people use a lot of different types of metrics to assess their succession progress. So other ones we've seen are things like employee engagement surveys. Engagement surveys may even have a subset of questions that ask about whether or not there's development going on in the organization and whether or not the organization is taking an active role in supporting development and growth. So that could be a sub area that you want to look at over time to see, okay, we're going through this process of developing successors. Is that being reflected in our engagement plan? Okay, we're giving group training. How are employees feeling about that? Another interesting one that I heard recently is just to the extent to which leaders can take their own PTO. So if you think about many organizations, senior leadership teams, they're working very hard, they're putting in long hours, and maybe they feel like they can't even take a vacation. They're scared to step away from their desk. They're not sure if the next generation of leaders or their direct reports can handle any challenges that might come across their desk in their absence. So I think this is a great indicator because we all need work-life balance and the ability to take PTO for our own wellness, and making sure that you're preparing your next generation of leaders and feel comfortable stepping away for a week or two at a time shows that the next generation is being prepared and you're not the only one carrying the workload for your team. So again, there can be a lot of different metrics that you can measure to assess progress, but we recommend you have at least 3 or 4 metrics so you can see how this progresses over time. However, we do want to address some common pitfalls that you might experience during succession planning. So some of the most common pitfalls include exclusively focusing on the executive level. While this is important and is our recommended starting place, it might be doing your organization a disservice to stop here. There are a lot of critical roles within an organization and a lot of critical people helping your organization to have success. And you want to look across your organization to make sure you are still acknowledging those other critical roles that would be beneficial to prioritize. So making sure that you don't just focus on the executive level, but as you can, you actually prioritize the entire organization's succession planning efforts. Another one is failing to update the document or process over time. So we see organizations that go through a big effort at the front end of succession planning. They create benches for all of their roles as well as success profiles, but then they kind of stop there. There's no one who is overseeing the process. They might not update it as vacancies occur and are being filled. So the front end work of succession is the heaviest lift, but it is still critical to make sure that someone is overseeing this process and updating the process and plan over time. The next one is keeping succession a secret. I know this one is tempting because it can bring up some fear when we talk about successors. We're scared of one person getting the idea that they are chosen for this next role as the one successor, when in reality, we're often choosing multiple and only converging on one person once it's time and there's a vacancy. But nevertheless, it's really important to talk about these efforts across the organization and create that high level of communication and transparency. So another thing you could do is think about how you want to frame this to your organization. It's totally fine if you want to call this a talent development process, because at the end of the day, you are taking a lot of the same steps as the talent development process. You are looking at developing your next generation of leaders to be ready when a vacancy occurs and you're going through developmental efforts. So that's one way you could reframe succession planning. Or you could just be really transparent and say that we are looking at the next leaders for our organization and we'd love for you to be considered. We're going to invest in you and we hope that when the time comes, you'll be interested in being a leader at our organization. So those are just a few thoughts on that common pitfall. And then lastly, delegating all tasks to HR. While it can be helpful to have HR as a part of this process, succession planning takes top-down buy-in and requires that leaders are on board. And also, frequently, individual leaders need to support the developmental process. So an example from earlier is we mentioned job shadowing. Well, HR can't be responsible for all the job shadowing happening within an organization. That's a leader to direct report or nominated successor relationship, and people need to be bought in across the organization in supporting the succession planning efforts. And this also relates to the greatest hurdle that we see, which is implementation. A few stats for you today is 67% of well-formulated strategic plans fail due to poor execution. And 1 in 3 leaders rate their company as poor or very poor in implementing strategic plans. This goes back to what I was saying before on it's kind of easy to get started on strategic plans sometimes, but not have that follow through. Companies may take the time to develop a succession plan, but might fail to develop their talent or to adequately prepare each candidate for each succession position. So if you're an organization that is struggling to allocate the time and resources to this is when working with a consultant may help. So another poll question for you is, how successful is your team in implementing strategic plans? We'll give everyone about 10 more seconds to answer this one. All right, so we see about 13% feels that they always follow through on their strategic plans. About half say that they sometimes follow through on strategic plans. 21% says they create strategic plans but rarely follow through. Another 17% says we don't really create strategic plans, and 4% is unsure. So a lot of variety here, with the majority saying sometimes plans are created, but they're not always followed through on. It's hard to make sure that we're following through on everything. We get busy in our day-to-day needs, and it requires an extra effort to make sure you're staying on point with your strategic goals. We have another poll for you, which is, what are the greatest challenges your team faces? All right, this was a select all option. So some of you may have selected multiple, but we see a huge number of people in our audience at 67%, about 2/3 feel that time is the biggest issue. And then about 25 to 38% for the rest see that buy-in, knowledge, standardization, having a dedicated team, and the long-term commitment is a challenge. So a lot of these other ones are also a challenge, but the time is the greatest. Thank you so much for engaging with our polls today. It's very helpful. So here I want to just emphasize some of the benefits of working for a consultant. We know some organizations feel a little hesitant to bring in consultants, but consultants are really beneficial when you're looking for specialized knowledge that would take a lot of time to build out in your organization, even if you hired one specialist in this area. Therefore, consultants can give you time back. For example, Sigma has a really streamlined succession planning effort that is based on best practices and leverages objectivity and assessments. And this can help save organizations a lot of time, as you don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to succession. So these streamlined methods really save time, as well as our team does a lot of analysis on the back end that we can do for organizations that would otherwise be having to go through this process themselves. The next one is process. We have some tried and true methods that we have used with many organizations in succession planning. We update our processes over time and make sure that we are providing the best solution possible. So that's a benefit of working with us, is we already know what is happening in the succession space, what are some of the challenges, and we take steps to avoid them. Accountability. If you're bringing someone in who is going to be helping you to walk through a process, it helps to enforce that accountability. We act as strategic partners that can keep you accountable to your goals. Objectivity is something I've mentioned a few times throughout this presentation, but by working with a consultant, you can add objectivity, because we're a third party coming in that is a little less biased around decision-making and helping you identify the next best candidates, as well as providing objective assessments. So I used to work at an organization where we would do assessments for the culture level for organizations, and companies and employees usually felt a lot better about someone else being the one to administer an assessment. And it's kind of similar here. When you bring someone in who is less entrenched in the everyday of your organization, we can kind of bring outside advice and expertise that you may not have the same level of objectivity internally. And lastly, expertise. We have an experienced team of many PhDs on our team who love this space of talent development, succession, coaching, culture growth. And we can draw on our years of experience working with clients who have been in your shoes in the past. So we're here to help. And you may be at various places in your own succession planning journey. So maybe you're here just looking for a little more education and templates and a succession planning process to follow. If that's you, that's great. We're here to support. We have a lot of free resources available to you. We have a succession planning guide and succession planning trainings that can walk you through each of these steps comprehensively. We give you access to our free templates, which we have developed based on best practices. And if you feel like you have the internal capacity to do succession planning yourself, you're welcome to access all of our free resources and get started. If you are someone who is looking for a little more hands-on help, I would recommend our individualized consulting with ongoing support. We have a succession planning launch, which helps launch you into your succession planning goals. And we do this through a 2-day workshop. So we just want to call out this succession planning launch that we have in case you are looking for more help in succession planning. We like to say that we can accomplish 6 months of work in 2 half-day workshops with your leaders. So we bring we usually start at the senior level, although some people will want to plan a launch for their top level and their next level down. And in the first half-day session, we come in and we talk about the first 3 steps of our succession planning model, which is identifying critical roles, then building success profiles and nominating successors. We gather all these information and do a lot of analysis on our end, create success profiles, create succession benches, and then we'd come back with your leadership team and validate what we've created, as well as talking about the last 3 steps, which is assessing development needs, developing talent, and measuring progress. At the end of this, you would receive a detailed 12-month succession plan for everyone on your leadership team. And you could take part in custom consulting, as we would be working with you hands-on helping you to draft the succession plan that's right for your organization. So feel free to contact me if you have any more questions about succession. You can reach me at athompson@sigmaleader.com. And thank you so much for joining us for this session today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you about succession planning, and we'll now open it up for a Q&A.
All right, thank you very much, Ariana. So we have some questions for you here. And as we said earlier, if any more questions come up as we go through, please don't hesitate to post them. We'll get through as many as we can. So number one, how do you approach leaders who only believe in succession planning from the top down?
That's an interesting question. I think that it's not a bad thing if your leaders want to approach succession planning from top down, because we do see some instances where HR leaders are the ones driving it and we don't have that top down support. So I could see that being a silver lining. If you already have that top down buy-in, that can hopefully help you to catalyze resources in your organization to get started on this. I think then the next challenge that you may have is then getting the organization bought in. So some things that can help with the organizational buy-in once you already have top-down support is organization-wide communication if relevant, or you can just communicate with those who the initiative is relevant to in this moment, making sure they understand what the objectives are of the succession planning efforts, what kind of processes and actions they're going to need to engage with, and what are some of the benefits to them. And I think then as you roll out some of your succession planning and talent development initiatives, people will begin to see the benefits and get more buy-in. So if you're the one that asked that question, let me know if that resonates and if you have any other follow-ups.
Thank you. Okay. Number two, so for small organizations, small to medium-sized enterprises, this is from someone at a company of around 150 employees. Can you speak a bit to stage 3 and stage 4, nominating successors and assessing development needs? How can that be done for an organization that has a limited talent pool size?
Well, I think you can be doing succession planning even at an organization as small as 30. So 150, you actually may have a significant talent pool available to you. So we would typically help you through the typical processes. Maybe if some teams were leaner than others, you may be interested in, as we say, casting a wide net and looking at people in other departments. Or if you feel like there's just not enough people, you may need to hire a little bit more anyways in order to create capacity. But then you would go through the typical steps of once you've identified those potential successors, you would potentially like to send out assessments, begin assessing those development needs, have those conversations between direct reports and leaders around where you see them needing to grow in order to take over that leadership role. And I think a lot of the same components would apply in this scenario.
I'll also send in the chat for you guys. We have a guide that focuses on succession planning for small to medium-sized enterprises. We've worked often with organizations of this size, so it's absolutely possible. And there's some tips in there on how you can cater the generic process to a specifically smaller talent pool. There's that.
Great. Thank you, Helen.
No problem. Okay, here's a great question that I think will resonate with many. EDI, establishing successors. How does the process stay objective and not introduce bias, negative or positive? And how can we ensure diversity? There's a specification here, particularly on some of the leadership competencies that we mentioned, like decisiveness or analytical orientation, which are sometimes more male-coded words.
Yeah, in this process, we like to really focus on the role itself. And we go through that process first of building a success profile to really understand the knowledge, skills, qualifications, and competencies needed to be successful. So then in theory, if you are looking at any qualified candidate with those criteria in mind, you would select multiple people so that alone helps diversity, because you're not selecting just one person to be developed. It's not, which means it's less biased to favoritism. And you're able to select multiple people You could, even if you wanted to reduce bias further, have each other check each other's benches, recommend any other people. You go through a collaborative process of selecting nominated potential candidates. And then also the assessment piece helps a lot. So then you can assess development needs. And maybe in your mind, you have a bias that one person is going to perform better on the assessment, but really the other person shows that they have as strengths some of the competencies that you're needing to see. And I think that we as a society are going to need to continue to degender some of the competencies and skills out there where women can have technical orientation and decisiveness, and men can also attract staff and coach and develop others. So I think we need to see it as a holistic process that can be engaged in by anyone, and that will help you to cast a wider net, really include anyone, even those with diverse opinions, with the objective of picking the person who's going to have the most success in the role in the future.
Thank you, Ariana. I'll also send a link to that assessment that you mentioned, the leadership skills profile revised. Our R&D team has done quite a bit of work on gender validation and things like that. So you can be sure that it's a validated scientific measure that can really help, as Ariana said, with making sure that the decisions are based on objective information. Okay, a question about succession benches. What do you do if 2 candidates fall in the level A category?
It is actually a good thing if you have 2 candidates in the level A category. That means you have 2 candidates that would be ready in the 1 to 3 year span. You can begin assessing their development needs and developing their talent. It's okay to tell them even that they're both being considered. If you decide to go that approach, some organizations decide not to be quite that transparent and just say that they're going through a talent development process, or even sometimes they'll develop a high potential program where they take nominations across multiple positions and put them in a high potential development process. But this means that you have 2 qualified candidates to take over a position if a vacancy occurs. They might need a little more development, but it means that you are preparing your organization in the event of a vacancy. And then once there is a vacancy, you can choose the next best person. And this can actually change over time what you initially think who will be the best person. We've seen people go through this process of, even for a CEO role, having 2 level A, 3 level A candidates being in process. And after a year or 2 period of development, it typically happens that one person tends to emerge as the most qualified for the role, and it's not even always who you first expect, which goes back to just letting things unfold through the development process and not biasing it by choosing one person in your mind ahead of time.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, next question is, what are the assumptions used in the succession planning process?
The assumptions used?
Yeah, so in our framework, are there any assumptions that need to be taken into account or filled before someone can implement these 6 steps in the organization?
Yeah, I mean, there will need to be some leadership support. So some different things that you might need in order to see success is creating capacity for talent development. Some organizations prefer to run really lean, where they are not enabling capacity for development and training and shadowing. So that's one consideration as you're considering prepping your organization for succession planning, is making sure that there is indeed that time, which, if you remember earlier, 2/3 of the group today said that time was one of the biggest constraints. But I'm a big advocate for reducing workload and creating space and capacity for developing talent. So that might be a challenge that your organization needs to tackle, especially if your senior leaders are more biased towards giving people a high workload and understaffing a little bit, which we do see quite frequently. Another assumption, and I'm just calling this one out, is that all of your talent should be internal. We are advocates for promoting internally, not losing that institutional knowledge, developing people who are a good fit for your culture, showing that there's a pathway throughout your organization. These are all really good things. However, there may be select instances where an external hire could be helpful if you need to bring in some specialized knowledge or skill set that is not currently present within your organization. So those are just a few things that come to mind, but if you had any other specific assumptions that you wanted me to address, feel free to put that in the comments.
Thank you. That's a great list. Okay, here's a great one as we think about strategic plans for the new year. How do you align your succession planning framework with the organizational strategy?
Well, if you think about it, succession planning should really integrate well with your organizational strategy, whether or not you are looking to position yourself in the market for innovation or even as a cost leader. You're going to want people in your organization who are aligned with your mission, growing and developing in order to have the skills necessary to make your organization effective. I believe that people are your organization. Organizations are made up of groups of people who fulfill an organization's purpose. So supporting your organizational employees by seeing them as potential candidates for future leaders, helping them to understand the institutional knowledge and methods that make your organization successful, and then developing them is going to also increase the likelihood that they're going to want to stay with your organization. And all of these things will support you in carrying out your daily operations and propelling your organization into the future.
Thank you. I'll also drop in the chat for you all a blog that was written just this year. That's not the chat. One moment, please. Here we go. A blog that we wrote on how to align your succession plan to your strategic plan. So there's a couple great steps that you can follow in there.
Helen has all the good resources.
This is the benefit of spending a lot of the time on our blogs and resources page. You learn to navigate it. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. So let's move along. Can you help me better understand the difference between the job description and a success profile?
Yeah, so a job description is what we typically use when looking to do replacement hiring for a position. It is very helpful and it is critical to a lot of things within understanding what roles we have and how they align. It also includes some of the basics that you saw on the side of a success profile. So things like core educational requirements, how many years of experience, then those really specific role requirements. So if they need to have experience with JavaScript or have these other specialized experiences included in there, could be previous experience leading a team if an organization finds that component important. But the success profile goes to the next steps by doing competency modeling, where we include leadership competencies that are essential for completing the job. And competency modeling adds a next layer of validity to the process because you're understanding at a higher level what kind of competencies are needed, both at the leadership level and at the role level. And then you can also use assessments that help to seek out an individual's competency level. So it really takes that next step by adding the competencies and then using those as a benchmark for which to consider future successors.
Great, thank you. Okay, you spoke a little bit about this in the content, but let's dive a bit deeper. How transparent should we be with our succession plans?
This is a question we get often from organization, and the answer is it depends. So it's going to really depend on your organizational context, how far, how many levels below you're actually engaging in succession planning. So if you're only engaging in succession planning for the first level or the first two, you might not want to confuse your organization by telling them everything about this initiative. So make sure, but at the same time, make sure you are keeping in the loop anyone who's going to be hearing about it. Something else you can do is continue to think about your own organizational framing and how does it make sense to talk about this. Something you can reorient to when creating this communication is, what are our objectives? What are we trying to get out of it? How are we measuring this? So you could even tell your organization, we're engaging in succession planning or we're engaging in talent development. The goals are to create career plans for our employees and increase engagement and reduce turnover. That's something that employees will see that you're making efforts not only for the organization, but for them as well. And it can actually boost morale in an organization. That being said, whatever you communicate, make sure you follow through on, because if employees hear this, but then there's no follow through, that could actually decrease engagement.
That's a really good point. Thank you. Okay, we have time for one more question. What is the best number of successors for each role?
I think if it was a perfect world, I would say that we have about 4 successors for each role. And that would also be in the case of people having development funds ready to build and develop those successors. But in reality, we see that it really varies. It depends on your team, the size of your team of direct reports, how specialized your knowledge set is for your position. So it's good to have at least 1 or 2, but if you have more, it just means that there's more people available to consider when a vacancy arises.
Makes sense. Okay. It is time to wrap up. If we did not get to your question, or if you have any others that pop up as you're viewing the recording or the slides, once we send those out, please don't hesitate to send us an email. We'd be happy to continue the conversation. If you liked what you saw here, oh, that's not what I'm supposed to say next. What I'm supposed to say next is, please let us know if you would like to receive credit for attending this webinar. We are both ATD and SHRM certified. We are missing the SHRM logo on here, which I will take full responsibility for, but you can also get a professional development credit for SHRM if you attended this webinar. So please just let us know in the poll that I just shared whether you would like a credit for either of those. For SHRM, we'll need to send you a certificate. So we'll make sure that we get that to you. If you liked what you saw here, we've got 2 more webinars coming up this year. One is another session. So if you want to send this to anyone on your team, feel free to get them in our December succession planning webinar. And then we've also got an interview with a leader character expert coming up. So that's a very helpful form of getting some tips and tricks for leadership development. And we will be releasing the calendar for 2024 soon as well. So stay tuned for that. And I'll send the link for this in the chat. And the last thing I'll say is that when you close out of this webinar, you'll see a feedback survey pop up. We do look at every single response to that survey, and we take your feedback into account when we're making changes to webinars going forward. So please do take a minute to let us know what you liked, what you didn't like, and whether there's anything you'd like to see in the new year. And we'd be thrilled to see what the appetite is out there and try it as best we can to meet it. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ariana, for being with us today, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you, everyone.